evening. We have a special guest with us. Our speaker is Dr Gillian Bickley. If you've read the library's Reading Club webpage, you would have read a little bit about her, but I'll tell you a little bit more. She has lived in Hong Kong since 1970. It says mainly lived in Hong Kong. We might hear more about that. She was a tenured lecturer here at University of Hong Kong in the early 70s in the English department. She has recently completed 22 years as senior lecturer / associate professor at Hong Kong Baptist. And she's also been a faculty member, interestingly, in Lagos and in New Zealand, in Auckland, New Zealand. For a number of years she was also the Hong Kong EA subject officer responsible for the Hong Kong CEE and Hong Kong AL English Literature examinations and the use of English Form 7 examination. She's the author of extensive number of articles, books and book chapters. Many of them are related to Hong Kong, and 4 of which we're going to hear from her this evening. And she's also edited 3 books on 19th century Hong Kong. So for our Meet the Author night tonight, Jillian will be talking about 4 of her works. The overall theme of the presentation, her presentation, is the human side of history, records of Hong Kong and its people, found in poetry, court cases and educational reports. The 4 books are For the Record and Other Poems of Hong Kong, Moving House and Other Poems from Hong Kong, The Development of Education in Hong Kong, 1841 to 1897, and A Magistrate's Court in 19th century Hong Kong. And if you haven't noticed, all 4 of those books are available for sale at significantly discounted prices at the exit, so take the opportunity. So with no more from me, I will hand you over to our guest speaker, Jillian.
So thank you very much for coming. In Hong Kong we're very busy. It's very difficult to spare time. In Francis Bacon's very well-known essay of Studies, discussing the reading of books, he writes, "Histories make men wise, poets witty, the mathematics subtle, natural philosophy deep, moral grave, logic and rhetoric able to contend." In other words, different types of reading have different results and different uses. As the title of my talk indicates, what I want to suggest to you this evening is a use for books which would never have occurred to Francis Bacon. His essay of Studies was first published in 1597, and the revised version which I quoted in 1625, both long before English was known in Hong Kong. So that's why I say he would never have thought of this use of books. My point is that the 4 books I present this evening are useful for the record they preserve of Hong Kong and its people. By Hong Kong people, I mean anyone who's ever lived in Hong Kong, whatever their ethnic, national or cultural origin, wherever they were born, and possibly indeed anyone who has ever set foot in Hong Kong, that is, during the time that they were here. Of the 4 books, the most obvious for readers to use for the record they preserve of Hong Kong and its people are the 2 books based on 19th century sources. That's this big fat book here, The Development of Education, and this one, The Magistrates' Court in 19th century Hong Kong. So both this book and this one are based on 19th century sources. I'll speak about those two books first, then I'll speak about the two collections of poetry. You'll be happy to see that these are very much lighter books. Very much lighter books. In my view, the poetry collections are equally useful for the record they preserve of Hong Kong and its people, but they may seem at first a less obvious resource. First, the development of education. The title indicates what the book contains: the text of official government reports on that part of education provision in Hong Kong which was aided or wholly funded by the Hong Kong government. The reports begin from the time when the Hong Kong government first began to contribute funds to education and, very properly, to monitor the uses of the funds through school inspection. The period covered by the book begins a little bit earlier, when the unofficial residence of British people began in Hong Kong in 1841. The period continues right up to the time when the new territories were added to Hong Kong's administration in 1898. I selected this period for three reasons. Firstly and secondly, it's a coherent and compact period, capable of being studied as a whole. After the new territories were added in 1898, the content of educational discussion became more complex, and the government education reports became longer and longer and longer. It wouldn't have been possible to include the earlier and later reports in one book. Thirdly, there was a clear link between the successive writers of these reports during this period, including four main writers. I can show you their pictures. The first Anglican Bishop of Hong Kong, this gentleman here, the Right Reverend Dr George Smith, previously a Church Missionary Society, CMS missionary. And this gentleman in the dark suit, Reverend Dr James Legg, the London Missionary Society, LMS missionary, and founder of Union Church. The Honourable Dr Frederick Stewart, this gentleman in pale grey at the bottom, the Honourable Dr Frederick Stewart, first head of the school now known as Queen's College, founder of Hong Kong government education. And this gentleman with the gold-rimmed glasses, Reverend Dr E.J. Eitel, a Basel missionary who later switched to the London Missionary Society. He was also editor of the China Review, a learned journal, and a writer on feng shui. So all these gentlemen had many different hats. Following Eitel's retirement in August 1897, the reports were written by people who'd had no personal contact with their predecessors and who also broke with their predecessors' tradition. This was another strong reason for concluding the book at the date I do. So then, the book contains edited government reports on education. It also provides extensive notes on the reports. There are also brief biographies of those four writers I mentioned and whose photographs I showed you. Two of those biographies draw on the same original sources as the two essays I've contributed to the hugely expensive Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, which appeared in September 2004. Thousands and thousands of pounds, about 60 volumes. If you don't have that, maybe you need this one. The book also provides 2 detailed indices, one to the original reports and one to my notes. The record of Hong Kong and its people that the reports and the notes provide includes many, many details and some names of schools, teachers, school managers, managing bodies, and a few pupils. They describe or comment on syllabuses, examinations, performance, policies, including language policies and religious education policies, alumni careers, relationships with the modern education system on the Chinese mainland. But the contents go beyond education itself. As we all know, education affects society, and society affects education. There's information about cultural differences as between East and West. The plague, superstition, sudden movements of population. And the following is a quotation, not from the reports, but from my own narrative. In 1894, as recorded in these reports, a serious outbreak of plague, that's bubonic plague, caused a first hindrance to the growth of modern Hong Kong education. In 1895, the government decided to promote English rather than Chinese education. Previously, both had been supported. And the government ruled that no new schools would be given grants in aid which did not offer, quote, a European education in the English language. That's opposed to a traditional Confucian education. As a similar measure, the following year, 1896, the Chinese classes at the major government school, Queen's College, which started life in 1862 as the central school, were abolished. The reason for these decisions was the fear that had been shown by the Chinese population at the time of the plague. People refused to permit government officers to enter their homes to carry out the necessary sanitary measures needed to control the outbreak and prevent its spread. Also, on one occasion, a panic emptied most of the Chinese schools. Why? Owing to the rumor that the government, this is quoted from the reports, owing to the rumor that the government had resolved, in order to stop the plague, to select a few children from each school and to excise their livers in order to provide the only remedy which would cure plague patients. This was a practice which Eitel says was sanctioned by Chinese medical beliefs at this time. Already in 1886, 10 years previously, as also recorded in the reports, the schools had been emptied when the rumors spread that a child was to be selected from each school and buried alive in the Tai Tan tunnel to ensure the success of the aqueduct. So who would think that reading through all these pages of government reports, you'd find such fascinating little pieces of information? If I hadn't read every word, I wouldn't have found those few little pieces. So apart from that, there are occasional anecdotes showing the interest and sympathetic feelings that even a school inspector, that very feared person, might experience. And this is a quotation from the Report on Education for 1867, written in January 1868. This is Frederick Stewart's report. And as I just mentioned, in most of the schools, I didn't say most, but in most of the schools it was a Chinese education that was given, the learning by heart of the Confucian classics. So this is what Frederick Stewart wrote in his report. Some of the boys will repeat, without a single mistake, the 4 books of Confucius. In one instance, in the Harker School at West Point, a boy brought up on the examination day an armful of books, consisting, you must excuse my pronunciation, consisting of the Shi King, portions of the Ku Men, the 4 books, the Odes for Youth, and 1 or 2 others, some 10 goodly volumes in all. When asked what he did with so many books, he said he knew them all. He began with the 4 books, and to my astonishment went on repeating as rapidly as lip and tongue could move for a quarter of an hour, when I thought it time to stop him. I believe he could have repeated the whole had there been time to listen to him. So again, it's a very engaging little anecdote showing us the reality of a village school in Hong Kong in the 19th century. I'm now going to go on to the second of the 2 books centered on 19th century sources, the Magistrates' Court in 19th century Hong Kong. This was published almost exactly a year ago. The sources in the second book are newspaper reports of court cases heard by one magistrate between July 1881 and March 1882. Altogether, there's just under 800 reports, and I've selected 100 or so in the book. I've grouped them according to the type of person appearing in court. A few of the people accused or as witnesses in the court were from the same groups as those recorded in the development of education: students, missionaries, teachers. Usually they were witnesses, but in some cases they were accused of some offense. In one case, a missionary had allowed his cow to eat young shrubs in Central. So again, this is a very different Hong Kong, where you would keep a cow in your garden in the central business area, and you would be fined if you allowed your cow to nibble shrubs, because they were very anxious to green Hong Kong at that time as well as now. So apart from the students, missionaries and teachers, other groups of people represented and recorded in that book include soldiers, sailors, policemen, husbands and wives, house servants, prostitutes, their associates and clients, kidnappers and traffickers in human beings, gamblers and informers, pirates and ship dwellers, shopkeepers and their employees and customers, rickshaw pullers and their clients, immigrants and travellers, and many others. Many names are given. Some names are completely adequate for tracing any other information that may survive about the people concerned, but many names seem to have been aliases or working names. I would say that these newspaper reports of court cases give a good general impression of the bottom and middle layers of Hong Kong society at the time. Additionally, they provide detailed information about members of the police force and some members of the legal professions. The index has an emphasis on personal names. Some of the sources, the court case sources, give quite vivid accounts of various episodes. For example, there was an incident when there was threatening and rude behavior by soldiers towards a group of important Parsi gentlemen when out for a walk in Kennedy Road. I imagine the Parsi gentlemen were wearing their traditional clothes, and the British soldiers, seeing people who looked different, thought they were fair game, and they were also drunk. So they behaved in a quite threatening manner and were brought to court. There's also an interesting, lengthy account of the events leading to a husband and wife finding themselves in court, together with some glimpses of the pidgin English which the wife, Jane McBreen, spoke. But it's not only the people we learn about from these sources. The court case reports also give a lively picture of Hong Kong urban and rural life and something about the life of those at sea. From the reports also, we can easily visualize Hong Kong streets and shops and street behavior. The arguments with rickshaw pullers, the drunken sailors, the gullible persons tricked of their money and jewels, young shop assistants unable to resist an unlocked till and sent to prison as a result. The stolen umbrellas. An awful lot of umbrellas were stolen, and it was reported in court. It seems that an umbrella was really a very precious object in Hong Kong at that time among the groups of people who found themselves in court. So many stolen umbrellas. Trousers stolen from a bamboo pole or through a window. The ladies of Lyndhurst Terrace, prostitutes in other words, sending their servant for a cooked meal after the time at night when a night pass was needed and getting their request refused. So when their servant didn't do what they wanted, one of the ladies hit the servant, who took her to court. And of course, we also learn about the law and the practice of the law. We learn something about the relationship between the Hong Kong administration and the authorities of Qing Dynasty China. In some cases in the book, I've worked backwards and forwards in time from these early 1880s reports. The book also contains information about revolutionary activity on the Chinese mainland and about mass sackings of police officers after corruption was proved. There are also introductory essays to each group of court reports presented. Here also I draw on contemporary materials, which initially I spent about 8 years reading. I wasn't only reading them, I hasten to say, but the elapsed period was 8 years, when I was often the only person in the Public Records Office, or one of two people in the Public Records Office, flipping through the pages of the China Mail and the daily press. And I hope readers agree that the essays on the people I've mentioned, the soldiers, the sailors, the prostitutes, the pirates, etc., are fresh, authoritative, and interesting. Apart from these 19th century materials, the book also contains chapters by 6 of our 20th or 21st century contemporaries, people we might all know. And they include a retired senior policeman, a practicing magistrate, a practicing barrister, a journalist, a cross-cultural specialist, it's my husband, and myself, writing from a historical perspective. Additionally, former Chief Justice Sir T.L. Yang has contributed a very interesting historical preface. Since these writers are Hong Kong people too, their essays give insights into their lives, as well as into the lives of the 19th century people they write about. Geoffrey Roper, in particular, has many interesting stories about Hong Kong in the 1960s and onwards. For example, he tells us how he once raided a house from the roof, just as in the 19th century there's a record of police raiding a house through the roof for gambling or drug-related offences. Gary Tallentire has a couple of interesting stories about cases which he himself has heard relatively recently as magistrate, including the allegation from a prisoner that he was made to strip and stand naked, legs apart, on 2 stools, while a police constable, this is what he alleged, when a police constable, supervised by a sergeant, tickled his testicles with a feather duster until he agreed to confess. Gary Tallentire did not believe this evidence. The book, published in a limited print run, has proved popular among legal professionals, and judging from public library borrowing rates, it seems also popular with the general public. I now move to the 2 poetry collections. For the Record, this rather nice flower, and Moving House. If anybody can guess where I got that illustration from at the end, I might even give you, will I give you a free copy? Will I? Can anybody guess where I might have got that? You can't see, but it's not fair, is it? Later on, you can have a look later and try and guess it. So the first book contains the text, also contains the text of a talk I gave to the English Society here. And the second book, Moving House, also contains an essay on new Hong Kong English language poetry. So poetry, but also some texts of 2 talks as well. So the first book, For the Record, and Other Poems of Hong Kong, has 2 main groups of subjects. One features people, birds, trees, living beings in their natural and man-made worlds, as seen and experienced in Hong Kong. And the other group relates and responds to personal events which were what they were because I live in Hong Kong. But it's the first group which is relevant to my talk this evening. So in this book, we find observations and reflections on Chinese and Westerners as the writer, or we say persona, so it's not really me, it's some persona, crisscrosses Hong Kong on foot or by public transport, making imaginative contact with other people. So in these poems there are old Chinese gentlemen with wispy beards, tourists, lady ikebana practitioners, hawkers, gardeners and garden owners, bird fanciers, expatriates, a Western Buddhist monk. I could perhaps just mention him. There is a, have you seen him? There is a Western Buddhist monk in Hong Kong, and he's been in Hong Kong since 1970 or so. And just before this book came out, as a total coincidence, I saw him on the MTR. And I thought to myself, shall I tell you? There's a poem about you in my book that's going to be published. Shall I tell you? But I didn't tell him. But fortunately, I met him after the book was published, and then I did tell him. And I was very interested. His accent, was he Dutch or was he German? Definitely he wasn't English. And I have seen him subsequently, but I've never been able to find out whether he's read the poem and what he thinks about it. So these are real people in here. They really exist. Also prostitutes, armors, queue jumpers, the new middle class, early school leavers, grandfather and granddaughter, early morning walkers, I understand a lot of Hong Kong Chinese poetry talks about early morning walkers. So without knowing it, I'm working in a tradition with other people. So early morning walkers and Tai Chi practitioners, students, audiences at cultural events, and a USD worker. There are accounts of Chinese opera performances, an equestrian opera. Did any of you go to see that? It was part of Le French May a few years ago. It was basically dressage, so horses, you know, doing very clever things. I thought it was a bit artificial. The visiting Cleveland Orchestra at the 10th Hong Kong Arts Festival with conductor Lorin Maazel. I thought he was wonderful. So as a result, I went home and I wrote a poem about the orchestra and him. We also hear the voice of a Chinese ancestor as his family visits him at Qingming Festival in 1991. There was a very bad hill fire and the family had to be rescued by helicopter. So I was quite moved and interested in that newspaper report, and the poem was a result of that. Varying threads of cultural difference are described or indicated. Cultural difference is wrestled with, and sometimes, not always, sometimes transcended. We also find materialism, consumerism, squatter huts, office towers, university campuses, including this one, Chinese restaurants, and Western launch picnics. The poems do show an awareness of Hong Kong history and changes in the Hong Kong environment. The title poem, For the Record, was written about 3 decades before the return of Hong Kong to the government of mainland China. It reflects on old photographs of Hong Kong, where the shutter speed was too slow to capture any but posed or posing human subjects. And it wonders whether non-Chinese Hong Kong residents will be given any place in future Chinese consciousness or history. I mean, a year or so ago, people were talking about Marco Polo. Did he really go to China at all? Or is it just the Chinese didn't think he was important enough to make a record of Marco Polo's visit? Another poem was written very shortly after the 30th of June, 1997, when, as we all know, Hong Kong was returned to the administration of mainland China. That poem ends with an epiphany, reflecting the imagined emotions of all those of any nationality who left Hong Kong prior to that change, feeling that they were leaving their real selves behind. A poem called Through the Lion Rock Tunnel describes what a trip to the new territories was like before the new towns were built. Totally different. When you went through the Lion Rock then, it was exciting, it was so different, it was so rural and steamy and exotic, quite different from what it is now. Speaking of For the Record, my colleague Cindy Chu has happily said, Bickley's work is fun to read. She is an expatriate, but sometimes with a local perspective. And David Wilson in the Sunday Morning Post said, Bickley succeeds in conveying the character of the fragrant harbour with humorous rigour. I'd like to hear your views in due course. Doesn't mean today necessarily, in due course. I'm not putting anybody on the spot. The second poetry collection, Moving House, and other poems from Hong Kong, has 3 groups of subjects. It also speaks of people seen and known, and general subjects of daily life observed in a Hong Kong context. It also reflects on people and events beyond Hong Kong. And there are reflections on personal relationships and the universal topics of change and loss. Again, it's the first group that's relevant to my talk this evening. Unlike the poems in For the Record, which were written over a period of 30 years, the poems in Moving House were all written very recently. But they also link back to memories beginning in 1970. From even further back into the past, glimpses of old Hong Kong appear, known from reading, attending lectures like this, and library and on-site research, including the research presented in the 2 source books I spoke about earlier. Moving House also records a wide variety of people: an itinerant knife sharpener, a limping young woman in a housing estate, an old man at a bus stop, somebody I describe as a Chinese cowboy with lilies. He was wearing a cowboy hat, he was standing at a bus stop in Tung Chung, and he was carrying some white lilies. He was a quite extraordinary mixture, so he was very interesting for me to think about. Who was he visiting? Was he from America, or did he just like that style of hat? I also describe a hacker grandmother with her sobbing grandson, actually at that very same bus stop. It's a good bus stop to be at. And academics at a conference. The thoughts of the goddess Tin Hao, we've had her birthday recently, are imagined at the time when one of her temples was moved to make way for the building of Chek Lap Kok Airport. The villagers who were her devotees are recorded too. I don't know if anybody else here saw that photograph, but in the newspaper many years ago there was a picture of a small boat with a few men carrying the image of Tin Hao, and they had to move her from her temple because the land was, the in-between land was going to be reclaimed to build the airport. And again, I found that very sad situation, and that's why I felt like writing that poem. So I'm imagining what Tin Hao felt like having to move after over 100 years. And preparing for this talk, I decided I really wanted to know where she was now. So where did they take her? I saw them in the boat carrying the image, but where did they take her? So I rushed around, phoned a lot of people, I looked at books, went out in a bus to a place called New Chek Lap Kok Village. And there I found the temple, and there I found the image. And the following day was the ceremony, so I went back to the ceremony. There was a gentleman there who knew English. He spoke, and I said, well, are any of these people the people who were in the boat in the newspaper photograph? And he didn't know about the boat. He didn't know, but I knew. So he spoke to the village headman, and he was very pleased, and he went back to his flat, and he brought his copy of a different newspaper report from the Oriental Daily, so in Chinese, with a lot of photographs, and you could say, this is me in the photograph. But he wouldn't let other people touch it because it was so very precious to him. So just thank you for asking me to give the talk, because I had a really good experience going to find the temple and meeting the villagers and taking part in the ceremony. Perhaps you'd all like to go to see that temple now too. You get a bus from Tung Chung bus station. There's a minibus. I think it's number 36. It's cheaper than the regular bus. That was the advice I was given, and that was the advice I took. So, Teen Hao. There are also stories of unplanned events, a visit to a fortune teller at Tai Wai, an encounter with an affectionate old couple at a public hospital, a chance meeting outside a well-known coffee shop in Central. Moving House shows the Hong Kong love of entrepreneurship, the Hong Kong lifestyle of constant movement from one dwelling to another. There's a roadside shrine, a dragon boat, fast food stores with their muzak, incongruous advertising. Transport habits are noticed at the bus stop and on the bus, on the MTR, among pedestrians. I'll ask you again, how many people here have the experience on buses that the person next to you is very tired and their head gradually falls onto your shoulder? So I have a poem about that experience. Then also some topics which shortly after I wrote the poems became hot topics in the media: the hanging of washing in public places and dangerous driving. So Moving House is the most recent book. It was published only a few months ago. We're still waiting for some reviews, but just a few days ago I received a review published in April of both the books, written by Ian Wotherspoon, who edited an anthology some years ago called Hong Kong Remembers. He writes, perhaps mainly addressing a mostly non-Hong Kong audience, but with experience of Hong Kong. And this is what he says. So he says, the poetry is fresh, insightful, and in rhythm with the sensitivities of a community passing through a period of political and social change. He says some of the reflective pieces are thought-provoking, even challenging. This may mean he doesn't agree with them. This may be a polite way of saying he doesn't agree. But he comments on the descriptions of people and commonplace events in Hong Kong. He mentions the poem Rain, which describes a squatter village after a downpour, a poem Moonshine, which contrasts the glowing lights of the city with the moon peeping between a corridor of high-rise buildings. You have to get up quite early to see that. After meeting an old couple in a public hospital, the tender language lessons speaks of shared humility and humanity. Graduation celebrates the young people who will help shape Hong Kong's future. And then he enjoys himself a little bit using alliteration. He says the poems will rekindle memories for many who lived in Hong Kong. Crowded streets and concrete, ferries and flower markets, the peak and paddy fields, trams and temple bells, and of course, the remarkable Chinese people who live in this special place. I'm going to end my talk by reading one poem for the record, and I'll then use it to launch my final remarks, if I can find the book. So this is the first poem in this book. I've already mentioned it. So for the record, on a showing of slides of images of old Hong Kong kept in the Hong Kong Public Records Office, then newly established. So imagine ourselves now sitting in the dark looking at the photographs on the screen. We sit in a darkened room gazing at the bright screen where images of old Hong Kong appear. An eerie silence drains the scenes. Few people, little life, that moves. Only buildings, low, with colonnades, huge trees. The peak, now lush and verdant, bare like a moonscape. It is cozy in the room, manageable, known, getting the history books in order before new possessors come. People came and went about their business, crossing the lenses of old cameras, but they, intent on things that stayed more permanently, ignored them, made no record. Will the Chinese cameras, moving in terms of centuries, not hours, notice us at all? So in this poem, as a relatively new arrival then in Hong Kong, I show sadness at the thought of the humble 19th century pedestrians whose existence the camera didn't capture. If you look at some of those old photographs, sometimes you see a blurred bit in the photograph. That blur was a person. The person walked in front of the lens, and so all that's recorded of them is just a blur. And that seemed to me so sad that a person had existed and the only record was a smudge on a photograph. I also betray sadness at my own inferred irrelevance, and rather wistfully wonder whether later generations of Chinese people will consider all non-Chinese so insignificant that they would never be recorded in Chinese history books. I want now to extend this thought to include us all communities as a whole, but also including the individuals within a community, need a record of their past and of their present, which constantly, of course, becomes the past. They need it for self-knowledge, self-esteem, and self-improvement. They also need a record of their past to support their status, maybe even their survival in the international community. But work has to be done to create and disseminate this record. Time-consuming, patient, expensive, and persistent work, such as that shared in the development of education and a magistrate's court. But creative writers also contribute to the factual record, of course, in a different way. They take in from their communities all sorts of impressions and information, and this merges and coheres and forms new constructs according to each writer's particular form of inspiration. And some of this is given back in work which is, equally with straight history, part of the community's historical record. Much of the information contained in For the Record and Moving House may never be available elsewhere, and certainly it's presented in very compact and readable form. I say readable because although it's poetry, it's actually quite simple poetry. And I think people are wrong when they imagine that poetry is always difficult. Not all people may be interested in the past. However, once introduced to a knowledge of the past, many find it fascinating. But there comes a time when people with little or no historical interest may have a use for the past. But if the record hasn't been created for them to use, they may lose out, perhaps as Central District residents may do, with their late attention to the history of important sites in their neighbourhood. But what are writers without readers? You, readers, have a large part to play. Me too, I'm a reader. We readers, have a large part to play in supporting and encouraging writers. Your presence tonight and at other such talks and events is valuable. Your purchase of books, your discussion of books, your recommendation to friends, your book reviews posted on the internet are valuable. It's you who encourage writers to continue to write. You who encourage publishers to publish. You who help libraries to continue to exist. No books, no libraries still. Thank you for your support in coming here tonight. Thank you, Hong Kong University Libraries Book Club, for arranging this and other book talks. Let's all make sure that the human face of history continues to be drawn in books. Thank you.
Well, you don't get off that easy. We are going to open up the floor for questions, but as the chair and host, I get to go first. I think it's truly fascinating, your correlation of history and poetry, and having read both the poetry books, I could identify with that. And I think everyone in this audience could easily identify with most of the poems in here today and can understand it as being something of a historical record. I wonder in the future, though, how the people who will be coming after us will view these poems and what they will make of them. But that's really just an aside. But I notice, you know, and you've mentioned it, there's quite a diversity in your themes. The deeply personal, which I found mostly in the more recent book, where you talk about visiting a funeral parlour, and you talk about getting on a plane to visit your father, in the poem that's called What I Wanted to Say, which I found particularly moving. But then you also have this wonderfully, what I call quirky, observationalist, Hong Kong-esque, that, you know, and you've talked about the people, the amas, the prostitutes, the Western Buddha and Buddhist and so on. But I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about these quirky events. And, I mean, will you be writing about anyone you've seen tonight, for example?
Don't need this now. Shall I just move it out of the way? Then you can see it. Sorry. Will I be writing about any of you tonight? Well, let's see. Wait for the next book. So basically, I think what happens is that just somebody catches your attention. There's something that makes you look at that person, you know, turn round and watch what they continue to do. There was a few weeks ago, I was crossing the walkway from IFC to join the escalator walkway, and there was a grandfather and a little boy, and the little boy fell down. Now, frequently one sees the adult picking up the child, shaking the child, and scolding him. That's quite normal behaviour in England, for example. But nothing like that on this occasion. The little boy fell down. The grandfather stood there, waited for the little boy to stand up. No words were exchanged whatsoever, and then they continued to walk. And that was really interesting behaviour. And so I noticed them, and I haven't written that poem yet, but I made notes. So sometimes what I do is I just make notes, and then if I do find that I've got time, I go back to the notes and see what I can work up to a poem.
Any other questions? I will ask that you take the microphone because we are recording this evening. So please raise your hand. We have roving microphones. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, my name is Maria Frances. I'm teaching here at Hong Kong U. I was also a student. I have two questions, Jillian. One on method, the other one on substance. I had the opportunity once to help someone looking at the public records, and we were looking for a woman who's supposed to have been in the madhouse, in what used to be the madhouse before. It's now the Victoria Prison, no longer the Victoria Prison anyway. And it was extremely difficult to go through the text because, first of all, as I understand it, the texts were mostly 19th century records were burned, actually mostly during the Japanese occupation and the war. So what we got in the public records was a copy of the originals that were kept in the Colonial Office in London. And many of these texts were facsimiles, which were copied and like put into a parchment form. I mean, you have seen that. So my question is, how easy in terms of method you found going through those records in terms of being the ability to read, but also, for example, going through comparative records like the collection of Carl Smith, which is available in the office, which he himself has gone through some of those original records, or, for example, comparing them with records of the burial records of St. John's Cathedral, which was also available as a point of reference. Perhaps I'd leave it to the method first and I ask the substance afterwards. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, well, the other person, you know, when I said that I was often the only person, and sometimes one of two people, the other person was Carl, in the public records office at that time. So, yes, I mean, a lot of records apparently were lost, but sometimes I feel that may be said partly as an excuse for not doing a really thorough job sometimes, because actually quite a lot of records do exist. The series you're referring to, I expect, is CO 1 to 9, the Colonial Office records, where what we've got, as you say, is what was sent to England. So the dispatches that the governors wrote from Hong Kong were then sent to England, and that's where they safely are. And then we also get the English side of the correspondence, but in draft. So in the case of the Hong Kong side of the correspondence, the final dispatches were in England, and the dispatches that were sent to Hong Kong, the final versions, were lost. But in England they have the drafts, and the drafts are very, very interesting because it shows the thinking that went into creating the dispatch. So it was circulated to various officers, and you see their comments on the draft, and then you see the successive versions, but you never actually see the final version because that's what was lost. What I did with that, in some cases where it was a really, really important document and I really wanted to understand it, and I wanted to understand the thinking of each of those officials in the UK, first of all I had to try to make a key of their initials to know who had said that. And then on one occasion I hired a researcher, because I wasn't in England, to check which writing was in red ink because there was some comment about see my note in red, and so I needed to know which was in red. But I don't think I ever really got to the end of studying that dispatch. So, you know, there's a limit. You can just do so much. I found that basically I just had to start at the beginning and go all the way through a particular series. So like CO 129, start at the beginning and go all the way through to where I wanted, but then go another 20 years forward or so in case there was some reference back. What I found very quickly was that I couldn't possibly make notes of all the things that I found interesting. because if I had done that, I'd still be there today. So it's all highly fascinating information. If you want an education and you don't want to produce a book, just go to the Public Records Office every day and read through them. Fascinating and free occupation. Doesn't cost anything. Air-conditioned, fascinating reading. I think it's more difficult to look for a specific piece of information. The easier thing to do is master the whole. But if you're looking for a particular person at a particular date, that's very, very difficult to do. So now the substance.
Basically, it's okay, you have obviously access to the raw material, and then a lot of books have been written already on Hong Kong history. I'm reading recently Stephen Chan's book, which is quite interesting, but definitely very analytical, and he has his own perspective. So when you read the raw data, and obviously you put it forward as it is in the first two books you mentioned, but afterwards I'm sure you do your own interpretation in the poetry. What do you make out of the Chinese history the Hong Kong history that has been actually written by other people? Like, do you have comments about them, or do you think it's accurate? Well, it's a very macro question, sorry, not very specific.
The works that were written a long time ago didn't have the advantages that we have today. So, for example, Endicott, his History of Hong Kong, is extremely readable, but that was written at a time when I think you went on leave by ship, and you came back by ship, and you went on leave once in 5 years, and perhaps you were away for 5 months or 7 months. But in those circumstances, one can only admire what Endicott did in his historical writing. There are, as you would expect, occasional parts where I think I might say they weren't accurate. But that's just because the world has changed. When Carl Smith speaks about his early research and how he used to spend his holidays in various archives in Europe, writing everything out by hand before there was even Xerox machines, or when Xerox was so expensive that nobody would use it, or the archives didn't have a Xerox machine and couldn't make copies for you. So the world has changed very rapidly, and that has made a big difference to the resources that researchers can access and use, and that must make a difference. Well, I mustn't say must. It should. It should make a difference to their accuracy. But again, it may mean that there's so much material that it's more difficult to get your head round it and produce anything. Hello, Dan.
Casting our minds back to the last speaker, around about a month ago, he was talking about the different stages of life, the schoolboy, the adult, the old man, etc., etc. And he also kept bringing in, if you remember, he kept bringing in, is there nothing else in life? He would bring in every now and again. In other words, nothing else in life except making money, in other words. Well, of course, yes, there is something else in life, not making money, to my way of thinking, and that is poetry, writing poetry. I've always been very interested in poetry. When I was a schoolboy, I was brought up on poetry, the same as English schoolboys are today. Are they? Are not? I don't know. I think one of my favourite poets was Wordsworth, I think. But also there was a man at this university who was a wonderful man, to my way of thinking. I heard him lecture. He wasn't a good lecturer, but he wrote beautiful poetry, and his prose was almost poetic. And you know who I'm talking about, of course, Edmund Blunden. Because Edmund Blunden was here. I heard him speak in the 1950s, and he was shortlisted for the Poet Laureate. There were 3 of them shortlisted for Poet Laureate. And Edmund Blunden, who was head of English department here, he was one of them. He wasn't nominated, he didn't get it, but very early in the 1960s, he went off back to England. It was a great loss to Hong Kong, because when I came to Hong Kong, I was told there were 3 world international scholars at the Hong Kong University, and one of them was Edmund Blunden. But
and have more time even to go around. I was in a public hospital waiting to see one of the specialists, and a gentleman came down the corridor talking to me. You see, he thought, this is a human being, she can understand what I say. So he had a great deal to say to me. And I said to him, you see, "Msik Teng, Msik Gong," you see. No, he kept on talking. And then his wife came after him, and she was laughing. And then I felt that I understood what that gentleman had said to me. I felt that what he had said was, there we are, my wife has gone to the wrong place again. I told her it was the wrong way, but she wouldn't listen to me. I was sure that this was what he had told me. So then the wife sat down, and she started talking to me. And so all I could do was I patted her hand, and I said, "Mr. God," and she kept on talking. And then I go to see the specialist, and I come out, and they're very interested to know, well, what happened, what happened inside? And they wanted to see my prescription, and they wanted to see when my next appointment was. So it's sort of obvious, in certain contexts, you know what people are saying, even if you can't understand the language. So that was the first occasion when I really felt, I know I just said you don't need language to understand the context, but I would have liked to have a conversation with that couple, because they were so very friendly, and they assumed I was a human being, just like anybody else. So I think it's partly the circumstances. The academic world is rather a remote world, isn't it?
I think we have time for 1, perhaps 2 more questions.
Maybe this is not a question, but a response. You mentioned about Bacon and the role of expatriates in Hong Kong. And also you wrote about the court and also the school. Surprisingly, I have a friend from mainland China. We have an overseas training course at Harvard. And we talk about what are the things in Hong Kong you see is you would like China to have more. And surprisingly, he mentioned, please cherish your court, law and order, because maybe in mainland China they need it so much. And also school. In fact, in Hong Kong, in China, a lot of the poor places still has not enough schools. So definitely, I believe that the expatriate has done a lot in these 2 areas. And I am a graduate of Hong Kong University. And at that time, I remember someone say something. Look at this little Englishman. He's Chinese, but then molded by the Hong Kong University as a little Englishman. But I'm proud of that because even Sun Yat-sen is a graduate from here. So he changed Chinese history. So you mentioned about a poem. What is the role of expatriates in China? I believe that you have done a lot, and there are a lot of changes. So this is not a question, but a response.
Hi. You titled your talk The Human Side of History, and it seemed like as you were talking that you are much more maybe taken with the human stories, the individual stories, as opposed to the events. And I'm wondering if that's so, if the people maybe are more important to the events than the events, and if that's so, then why?
think that's probably a correct observation, that people are very interesting. But why? Why? I can't answer that question, because perhaps it seems to me obvious that people are more important. People make events after all. But yes, I do find people interesting, rather than politics, for example. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. Can you share your opinion about the translated poems? Or say, do you have any requirement if your poem are to be translated into a Chinese language or other languages? And do you think the readers can have a true or real understanding by reading the translated poems?
Thank you for your question. You mentioned earlier that you're interested in poetry. I don't mind. I don't have any requirements for translations of my poems. If you're offering, I would love to have a translator of the second book. Somebody's already translated the first book for the record into Chinese, but we have yet to find a publisher for the Chinese translation. Obviously, I'm not in a position to say whether the translation is expressing the same ideas as I expressed. I don't think I mind. People say that translation is a new creation. In any case, that a translation is not necessarily giving the words and the attitudes of the poet, but it's somebody else's work based on the earlier poem. That's fine by me, as long as it doesn't make me say anything which is going to get me into trouble. as long as what's said in the translation is innocuous enough. Are you offering? Maybe we can speak afterwards. Yes. Does anybody else have any thoughts about translation? Ms. Jen? No. Okay. What? Anything?
Just now you said that you do not have an audience in mind when you do your works. Okay. But do you think your works will be understood better by people with experience or knowledge of Hong Kong, or rather, would it be a good idea if you can put both things together? Say for your 4 books, you put part some history and then followed by some poems, and so that people can understand if you do not have much knowledge about Hong Kong, then they can understand a bit of history and then a bit of your poems.
I think that's a very good point. I think what you say is correct, that for many of the poems, it's people who have had some knowledge of Hong Kong who will understand the poems better, because in a sense it's giving them back experiences that they also have had. So I think that is true. Your suggestion, if you would like to do that, that's fine. If you would like to make selections and put them together, I don't think, well, I think about it. But if anybody else would like to make selections, that's fine. I think it is important for people to write local poetry, broadening that point a bit. But I think it's also important for people to try to make the local universal. And that's something I'm only just beginning to do, I think. So some of the personal poems are more universal because they're the universal themes, death, loss, sadness, etc. These are universal themes. But the Hong Kong poems responding to people probably remain local. So I have to learn how to make those less bound by Hong Kong, remaining about Hong Kong, but somehow having a broader application as well. I think that's a very good point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jillian. It's been truly wonderful, vivid, enlightening, entertaining. Your enthusiasm for your work and for Hong Kong is palpable and quite infectious, and I think everyone here has learnt something tonight and will want to buy your books. But before we let you go, I would really appreciate it if you would indulge us and just read this last poem as a farewell gift for the audience.
This is the Hong Kong.
Yes.
Hong Kong. Can I borrow that one? Thanks very much. So this is about Hong Kong U. It's called Early Morning at the University of Hong Kong campus is a special world. Early morning at the campus is a special world. As I start to enter it, a briskly walking group of women down from the peak are barely restrained by their abrupt leader from challenging my slow car. Inside the barrier, scattered individuals and couples possess the spacious green world that still remains, interspersing the modern buildings that the Custom Plan, finally effected, has presented to thousands of new students. Visitors returning can still trace old paths, see replaced buildings, know where the lily pond is hidden and the rare trees grow. The mourning owners of this place, built with the Boxer indemnity, still believe it is all theirs. A neat old lady is quite au fait with the heavy glass doors near the computer room, and an elderly couple practice Tai Chi in front of the mini bank and bookshop. Students still sleep in the library, know English picked up from American films, and yearn for future days. Songbirds express their joy, and a coal bellows. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Jillian. We have just one last part of the proceedings, a small presentation, and this is a souvenir that works many wonders. It's a book plate that's been placed, it says, in honour of Dr Gillian Bickley for her support to the Reading Club of Hong Kong U Libraries, and this has been placed in one of the volumes. So thank you.
Exciting. Thank you so much. We're going to smile at the...
Yes, there you go.
This is Hong Kong. We have to smile.
And thanks for all for coming. There's still some food left, so please help yourselves. Thank you.